All eyes are on the national capital, New Delhi, as the G20 summit is all set to begin. Joining us at the moment for more on this, we have with us Tony Abbott, former Australian Prime Minister and currently advisor to the UK Board of Trade. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Abbott, and speaking to us here at Times Now. Let me begin by asking you, when PM Modi first became the Indian Prime Minister to visit Australia in 28 years in 2014, you were the Australian Prime Minister at the time, and it was then that your country was hosting the G20 summit. Now, we have a G20 summit taking place in India under its presidency. Tell us about how you believe India has changed between 2014 and now, and how do you look at this presidency in the Indian context so far?
Well, the G20 presidency is a wonderful opportunity to showcase your country to the world, and I think Australia did pretty well at all of that back in 2014. Obviously, this is a very good time for India to be hosting the G20, because under Narendra Modi, who's been a quite transformative leader, India has become the world's fifth largest economy. I think the Indian economy is really taking off. You only have to look at any significant sized Indian city and to see the infrastructure works going on to realise that India really is booming. It's been the world's fastest growing large economy over the last couple of years. And so I think people are looking at India not just as the emerging democratic superpower, but as a country that could possibly substitute for China in so many of the global supply chains that China has colonised over the last couple of decades, given the strategic difficulties that so many countries now have with China. So this is a time of vast potential for India, and I think under Prime Minister Modi, India is very well placed to capitalise on that, not just for India's benefit, but for the benefit of the wider world too.
Right. Mr. Abbott, Indo-Australian ties have deepened significantly since then, and they've also acquired a strong strategic dimension over time with the Quad. Specifically in the context of Australia, how do you see this relationship with India evolving?
I think that the Australia-India relationship for a long time was somewhat underdeveloped. You were right to mention that there was a 27 or 28 year gap between prime ministerial visits. Given the size and the growth of the Indian economy, our two-way trade was not as substantial as it should be. The fact that Australia and India have recently been able to conclude a very good trade deal, India's best trade deal, another G20 economy, I think is a sign that there is only upside to the Australia-India relationship. Australia and India should be natural partners. We share democracy, the rule of law, to a great extent the English language. India is now Australia's largest source of migrants. It's certainly a very large source of overseas students. So I think this relationship is taking off just at a time when India generally is making its presence felt much more strongly on the partnership.
Right. You said something very significant recently, and I'm quoting, you said that the world is divided already, particularly with China's grab for global dominance. At the moment, the world is highly divided between democracies and autocracies, and India's membership in the Quad places it in the camps of democracies against autocracies. In that light, what's the message that you think the G20 under India's presidency ought to send to China?
Well, that's exactly right. India is now very much in the democratic camp in the emerging struggle between democracy and dictatorship. I think it's quite significant that President Xi Jinping of China has chosen not to come to India's G20. And frankly, rather than a sign of strength on China's part, I think that's a sign of weakness. I don't think President Xi wanted to be in New Delhi and discover that he was outshone by Prime Minister Narendra Modi.
Right, and I ask you this specifically in the context of Chinese aggression on India's borders. Now, we will come to the complaints and concerns that other countries, including Australia, have about China. But India's been telling the world, particularly Europe and the United States, that they've been largely silent about the violation of sovereignty and integrity of territories by an expansionist China in India's neighborhood, while expecting India to take a position on Ukraine. How do you respond to the charge or the claim by India that there have been double standards?
Well, I certainly think that there's been plenty of awareness on the part of countries like Australia of the Chinese belligerence on the border with India. We've been very conscious of the attacks that China has mounted across the border. We're very conscious of the fact that the Chinese have just published a map, or Beijing has just published a map which is claiming Chinese control not just over the South China Sea but over parts of Indian territory. So I think we're very conscious of the fact that China's belligerence is not just confined to Hong Kong, it's not just confined to Taiwan, it's really extending to all of China's neighbours. As for India and Ukraine, well, I understand India's long-standing friendship with Russia, but I also appreciate that Prime Minister Modi was very forthright with the Russian dictator at a meeting in the last few months. And I also think it's important to remember that the average Indian understands that what Russia is doing in Ukraine right now is simply evil. Yes, for all sorts of reasons of diplomatic prudence, there might be only so much that India chooses to say and do publicly. But I don't think the people of India are under any misapprehension about the nature of Russian aggression.
Mr. Abbott, the current Australian Prime Minister will be visiting China towards the end of the year. And yes, there have been issues between Australia and China, including legislation adopted by Australia against overseas influence operations, the ban on Huawei from 5G contracts, for instance, amongst other matters. Now, China makes up for 1/3 of Australia's international trade. However, there is dependence. Now, should a democratic Australia de-risk, if not decouple, from an autocratic China?
Well, that is a very good question, and I think it's to Australia's credit that we have not let our substantial economic interests in trade with China compromise our important beliefs and values in liberal institutions and a free and democratic way of life. I think it was good that Australia really led the world in keeping Huawei out of 5G systems. It's good that Australia was brave enough to demand a full international investigation into the origins of the Wuhan virus. So I think this is a sign that under governments of both persuasions in Australia, we have been prepared to stand up for principle and haven't let short-term economic interests compromise our long-term national interest, which is in a stable, rules-based global order. And thank God under Prime Minister Modi, India is prepared to stand with its fellow democracies in that bid to ensure that the world stays peaceful, ordered, cooperative where possible, but not compromising important principles.
Right. I ask you this because concerns about not just the absence of democracy in China are there, but its trade practices have prompted many countries, including UK and US, to at least speak of revisiting the extent of trade with China. Do you believe this is signaling more than concrete action?
I think there's no doubt that many countries, including Australia, are trying to ensure that we are not vulnerable to Chinese trade boycotts, because what's become perfectly obvious by the way China has treated Australia over the last 2 or 3 years is that the Chinese view trade as politics by other means, and that they are prepared to turn trade on and off like a tap if it suits what they see as their long-term strategic interests. So I think it is important that countries try to ensure that they are not vulnerable to Chinese economic pressure. But that doesn't mean that we can't trade with China. It just means that we need to be very careful about ensuring that we are not critically dependent on any immediate Chinese supply of things.
Right. And also, Mr. Abbott, the issue of debt, especially amongst countries in the global south, is also likely to come up during G20 talks. How real do you think is this concern about Chinese debt trap, given what we've already seen happen in Sri Lanka recently?
That's a very good point that you raise. And because Sri Lanka injudiciously accepted Chinese loans to build substantial infrastructure, it now finds that the Chinese actually own substantial slabs of their infrastructure, and the country is, in a sense, dependent on China in a way that I'm sure very few Sri Lankans like, because Sri Lankans, like most people, are decent people, and they don't want their country to be dependent on any other, particularly one which can't always be relied upon to have their best interests at heart. And again, this is where India is such a flagrant contrast with China under the CCP, because India has consistently pursued a good neighbour policy, or sought good relations with all of its neighbours. Just unfortunate that one in particular has never really reciprocated.
Right. Mr. Abbott, China appears to be the elephant in the room clearly, but how do you think the absence of Xi Jinping from the summit will impact the interactions during the G20 summit? Because this has been spoken about a lot, and what do you believe could be the reason for his absence, Mr. Abbott?
Well, it's always an interesting question, isn't it? I think it was Winston Churchill who said of the Soviet Union that it was a riddle inside a mystery, inside an enigma. And communist systems are closed systems in a way that democracies aren't. And it's very hard to know exactly what's going on inside the Politburo, who's on the rise, who's on the fall, who's threatening whom. And as we have seen in times past, there can be sudden, drastic, even brutal changes inside communist regimes. So it's hard to know exactly what's going on in Beijing just now. It could simply be that Xi Jinping doesn't want to come to Delhi because he doesn't want to be upstaged by Narendra Modi. It could be that more is happening inside the Politburo than currently meets the eye. And I suppose the recent very short tenure of the Chinese foreign minister suggests that things might not be going the current regime's way.
Right. Mr. Abbott, coming back to India-Australian ties, India has been very concerned about the spate of attacks that we've witnessed in Australia in the recent past on Hindu temples and places of worship by Khalistani separatists. Now, this has unfortunately also happened elsewhere. How does Australia make sure that secessionist elements unfavorably disposed towards India are nipped in the bud? And I ask you this because there's a counter-terror and strategic dimension to the Indo-Australian relationship as well.
One of the very encouraging things is the growing security relationship between Australia and India, and the fact that Australia has recently participated in the Malabar naval exercises, indeed even helped to host them, is the strongest evidence of that. I don't think there's any serious person in Australia who wants to give any encouragement at all to secessionist or separatist movements inside India. I accept that there are a few misguided individuals who are campaigning, if you like, for counterproductive change within India, but I wouldn't want to overestimate just how many people there are who want that. And I would ask people in India to see this matter in a proper perspective. Yes, there's been some most unfortunate graffiti on Hindu temples and so on. It's a crime to deface places of worship, and I'm confident that the Australian authorities will be doing everything they can to ensure that all places of worship are properly protected. They're not defaced, they're not vandalised, they're not damaged. and will be better in the future at ensuring that agitators don't come into our country in the guise of tourists.
Mr. Abbott, trade is also going to be an important part of the discussion agenda. India and Australia are negotiating a free trade agreement. There is an interim arrangement in place. But do you see these negotiations and how do you see them, in fact, panning out? What could be the potential sticking points in your view?
I wouldn't want any Australian or Indian business to not enter each other's market on the grounds that the current arrangement is only interim. The deal that's already been done is a very good deal. Under the deal that's already been done, something like 100% of Indian exports will eventually enter Australia free of quotas or tariffs. Something like 95% of Australia's exports will enter India free of tariffs or quotas. So even this interim deal is a very good deal. And I think that there are great opportunities right now for Australian and Indian businesses to do better business in each other's country. I keep saying to every large Australian business, just as a couple of decades ago, you all had a China strategy, what you all need now is an India strategy, because not only is India a huge potential market for our exports of goods and services, it's also a wonderful place to source the intermediate goods that we need, particularly those things that are currently coming from China, because supply chain vulnerability is one of the big problems that so many of us face, given the growing strategic competition between the dictatorships and the democracies.
Right. You're also an advisor to the UK Board of Trade, and India and UK too have been discussing a free trade agreement. We've been told that it is currently in a fairly sensitive stage. What are the likely challenges or disagreements that the two sides might have to address before this finally materializes?
My understanding is that the negotiations are at a sensitive stage. I don't really want to comment on the detail because I'm not sure that that would be altogether helpful. I just think that it's in both countries' interests to do this deal. It really is in both countries' interests to do this deal. Firstly, for Britain, because it will help demonstrate to Britain and to the wider world that Britain is once more global Britain since leaving the European Union. And I think it will help the Made in India strategy of Prime Minister Modi if this deal with Britain can be done, because it will obviously make it easier for British companies to invest in India, and indeed it will be easier for British companies to source componentry and all sorts of other things from India. So I think this is not just an important sign of the growing partnership between India and its fellow democracies, but an important sign that India is now a global player rather than simply a subcontinental giant.
I ask you this, sir, because India, Australia and UK are all democracies and they've had their constituencies that they have to cater to domestically, and issues such as free trade will inevitably invite scrutiny on how much each side is conceding, how much its own domestic industry can be protected, how its agricultural sector, for instance, and the rights of farmers can be secured. And we actually did see this play out when India opted out of the RCEP framework. So in that context, how tricky a terrain are these countries navigating?
It was a very shrewd move on Prime Minister Modi's part to opt out of the Chinese-led Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership deal. And I suspect that it was strategic considerations as much as economic ones that led to that move. Look, there are always domestic sensitivities, but freer trade is good for both countries if those countries accept the same basic norms. They accept that commerce is commerce as opposed to strategy by other means. They accept the rule of law. They accept that a deal is a deal and the sanctity of contract. I mean, I think that in the medium term at least, freer trade between Britain and India, just as freer trade between Australia and India, is going to be good for businesses and jobs in both countries because, let's face it, at least in the case of Australia and India, and I think Britain and India too, there is a great deal of complementarity.
Right, and finally, Mr. Abbott, what are you hoping to see in the joint communique at the end of this G20 summit? Because, you know, the last few days we've seen intense negotiation between the Sherpas. They've been meeting in, of course, the outskirts of New Delhi. And also there have been all sorts of proposals, for instance, the African Union, you know, being invited to the G20 permanently. All of these are suggestions that are on the table. What would you expect to see? What do you hope to see?
Well, I certainly would have no objection to the OAU attending G20 summits as an observer participant in the same way that the EU attends G20 summits as a observer participant. So I think that's all to the good. And yes, given that the African population is growing rapidly, and given that economically Africa is starting to improve significantly, I think that's all to the good. In the end, the greatest benefit of these G20 summits is the opportunity for senior leaders in all the relevant countries to get to know each other better, because in the end, there's no substitute for a personal relationship, particularly when countries have to cooperate, as indeed they do increasingly in this fraught but interconnected world. So I would certainly hope that a strong statement on the need for large countries to avoid bullying their smaller neighbours finds its way into the G20 communique, because while I understand India's sensitivities with respect to Russia and in respect to the Russian military equipment that it still uses, the fact is what Putin and his hench people are doing in Ukraine is simply evil, as we see by the repeated bombing of civilian infrastructure. Now, this is just wrong, and I don't think any decent people, and I don't think any decent country can be indifferent to it.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Tony Abbott, for taking the time out and speaking to us here, and of course giving us your insights into not just international trade but also strategy and what India can hope for as far as the G20 summit is concerned. Thanks so much for joining us.